Galapagos Islands and Darwin's finches. And the fact that Darwin, who was a naturalist, who enjoyed studying nature, who was looking for patterns, was on this trip to survey the world and collect data for Her Majesty and the country of England. And it was while he was in the Galapagos Islands, this area of very varied environments. All these different islands, different beaches, different parts of the islands were actually forcing different organisms to survive better. So if we were to put this whole population of variation in different environments, some would survive better. And we are going to begin to call that differential reproduction. And so Darwin, his idea is that species are unstable. So he returns from South America, the Galapagos Islands, with all of this data, not just the finches, lots of other organisms. This data that species aren't permanent, they aren't fixed, that they change over time. And so as he's thinking about organisms and populations changing, he's thinking about where did this come from? When does a species originate? And so Darwin's book is called The Origin of Species. I've never actually read the whole book because it's pretty dry. But the idea is that he actually was able to look at variation, identify that the ones that survived in certain environments reproduced more, and think about where they might have come from, this idea of a common ancestor. And so we've already identified the role of environment, the role of inheritance, and now we want to look at the importance of actually reproducing. And so when Darwin wanted to share his ideas, he has this data. There was a lot of pushback, a lot of people who were not comfortable with the idea that species change. They thought that species were fixed, that that organism has been on Earth forever, exactly the same way. But so Darwin started to look around in other environments for data to support that species change. And he actually noticed it a lot in breeding. And so one of the places that he turned was agriculture and this idea of selection. And so what we're looking at with selection is the idea that there is some sort of advantage. Darwin was arguing that nature did the selecting, but he thought that he could refer also to selection that happens in agriculture. So for example, if we look at cows and the idea that a farmer wants lots of big, fat cows that will produce lots of milk or meat. And so what's happening in artificial selection is that the farmer is actually choosing which organisms. So in breeding, the breeder or the farmer is selecting who mates. When we're talking about animals, farmers will actually pay a stud fee. They will go out, pick the best male, pay a fee, bring that male back to mate with all its females. And that is selective breeding. But it turns out that results in artificial selection. And we see this actually with the dogs really commonly. So dog breeders are going to select for certain traits. And that's how we have a variety. Because we've actually continued to combine certain traits on purpose. And so a dog might be tall, but then might have different types of fur. And this is going to happen in nature as well. Evolution is not one point that we're trying to get to one end destination. Evolution is all about what survives best. And sometimes that changes. And we're going to look at what does it mean to go forward and can evolution go backward. And so Darwin actually held off for a really long time on presenting any data. And it wasn't until another man named Alfred Wallace, and so we're going to kind of throw this guy in here. Alfred Wallace is who drove Darwin to publish. Darwin held off for a really long time time. He really wasn't comfortable going public and across the world with his data. Alfred Wallace actually began to make a lot of the same observations, contacted Darwin, this renowned naturalist, for advice on getting ready to publish, and so they actually jointly published. So what is it that we really think about when we think about evolution? Evolution is driven by the process of natural selection. So it's a series of steps and conditions. So a series of steps and conditions. And what's going to happen is something in the environment selects organisms to survive. Of course, we know it's not just enough to survive, they also have to reproduce. So natural selection really just is a set of steps and conditions in which the environment selects organisms to survive and reproduce. So these are kind of the main steps. First, variation has to exist. Natural selection does not cause variation. Natural selection selects on variation that already exists. The variation is going to exist first in the genotype. And we know where that comes from. That comes from mutation, that comes from crossing over. But it has to be genotypical variation, and that genotypical variation has to produce phenotypical variation. Because even the DNA might be different, but if their appearance is the same, then you're going to be equally likely to survive. So the key really is that it has to be DNA variation, and that DNA variation needs to show up in a phenotype. There needs to be some sort of competition, which means unequal survival. So if everyone can survive equally, then everyone survives. There's no advantage. And so unequal survival means some have an advantage. Well, the idea is who. This is kind of the hanging point. Who has the advantage? And that really is dependent upon the selection force. The selection force is that thing in the environment. So, if we pause here and stop and we say we've got a population of beetles, we have variation. Does it matter that there's variation just looking at this picture? Not really. The variation doesn't start to matter until the predator comes. And the predator seems to be eating all of the green beetles. So we do have to keep in mind that just because there's variation doesn't mean there'll be natural selection. That variation has to mean something. It has to mean that some will survive better. And something has to choose, and it's the environment. And so a selection force, think of literally pushing or choosing. The selection force will produce survival of the best fit. We're going to talk about fitness in just a second. But the main idea here is that once I survive, I also have to reproduce. So it's not just enough to survive, as we keep saying. We have to survive long enough to reproduce. And the offspring need to survive as well. If there's many more offspring surviving, we're actually going to have more competition. So what we want to be able to do is analyze a scenario for variation, for competition, for selection forces. If it were to all of a sudden let's say we're looking at a tree with no green leaves on it. Let's say we're in the winter right now, and we're on a tree and there's no green leaves. And so all there is brown bark. Well, that's why these beetles are surviving. They're camouflaged. But what if spring comes and then the tree is covered in green leaves? Then the brown beetles might stand out. Of course, none of it matters unless there's a predator or something that's selecting who survives. like selecting a mate or being able to find shelter. So there are lots of different factors that lead into best fit. But the key is always going to be that the more you reproduce, the more the trait is inherited. And this goes back to why Darwin's theory is supported by biology. The fact that we have DNA that is inherited and that it's passed on through reproduction. Those are really important ideas. Now that we know about DNA, now that we know about meiosis, we really start to understand exactly how this works. So, in order for natural selection to occur, there must be variation already existing. There must be some sort of competition or unequal survival. Something is predicting or choosing which ones will have an advantage. And those that are best fit will survive longer, reproduce more, and inherit the trait. The case study that you were looking at really had connected to this idea that you have to reproduce more. That just surviving longer isn't really what matters. It's all about reproducing. So the last thing that we want to look at in terms of has natural selection, has evolution happened, is did the population actually change? And so when we look at has a population changed, really what we're looking at is the gene pool. Even though we see phenotypic selection, so the selection force acts on the phenotype, The bird is not looking at these beetles going, I like this allele. I'm not going to eat this allele. Or I don't like this allele. I am going to eat this allele. The bird has nothing to do with the DNA. The bird is acting on the physical appearance. So selection acts on the phenotype, but the phenotype that reproduces so phenotype reproductive rates equals what genes are passed on. And really it's not what genes, it's which alleles of which genes. And so this is why really, if we want to know if a population has changed, we look at the gene pool of the alleles, and we're going to start to say the frequency. The frequency of the alleles. So when we look up at the top picture of the beetles and we compare that population to this population, we would compare the frequency of the alleles. And that's what we'll start to do mathematically. So what we have here is a set of circumstances in which will natural selection occur and how will I know if it has occurred. The final thing is to keep in mind, what does it mean to be fit or successful? For humans, success is all about money. But for organisms, success is about reproduction. So fitness really just depends on being able to survive and reproduce. And what we have to be careful about is assuming. We need to be able to consider all of the factors that play into survival. So it's not just, can you catch food? It's, can you catch the food? Can you digest the food? Can you keep the food? Can you feed your offspring? Can you attract a mate? And so we start to see that there are a lot of interacting factors here, and that there is no direct pattern that is consistent. The environment will change, and that will change who is surviving. We also start to see the idea that there is no perfection. If we look at a cheetah and we think, well, longer legs means you can run faster, but longer legs also mean more fragile bones. And so there is no one direction, there is no perfection, there is no one end goal. The environment is constantly changing for the most part, and which organism is fit really just depends on the environment, which is why it's called natural selection.